Blood drips from trembling hands into Jerusalem's dust, each crimson drop a thundering accusation. Jesus of Nazareth stares at the fallen Roman soldier, the man's short sword still warm from where it had been pressed against his throat moments before. Now the blade lies in Jesus' grip, its edge stained with the soldier's life. The evening air grows thick with the metallic scent of blood and the weight of impossible choice. "Father," he whispers, his voice cracking, "forgive me." Behind him, his followers stand frozen, their faith confronting a reality they never imagined. Their messenger of peace has taken a life. The gathered disciples draw back as Jesus stumbles to a nearby well, plunging his hands into the cool water. "You taught us to turn the other cheek," Peter whispers, his voice trembling with uncertainty. Crimson clouds bloom beneath the surface as Jesus scrubs his hands raw. "And what of God's commandment, 'Thou shalt not kill'?" Jesus closes his eyes, feeling the weight of every scripture he's ever preached, pressed down upon his shoulders. The dying sun paints Jerusalem's walls blood red, while Roman patrols clatter through distant streets. Their presence grows stronger each day, like wolves circling a flock. "I've spoken of loving our enemies," Jesus says finally, his words heavy, with the iron taste of consequence, of God's perfect love. But we live in an imperfect world, where Roman steel meets flesh, where children cry for bread, where good men die in chains. He turns to his followers, water still dripping from his hands. Perhaps the greatest test of divine love is choosing to bear its burden in a world that crucifies it. Mary Magdalene steps forward, her dark eyes searching his face. Around them, the evening prayers begin to echo from the Temple Mount, a haunting reminder of everything at stake. The Romans are watching more closely now, their suspicions of rebellion growing. Each day brings new threats, new choices between survival and principle. And now, with blood spilled, there can be no return to simple parables and peaceful teachings. Dawn finds Jesus kneeling in the Garden of Gethsemane, olive branches casting shifting shadows across his face. The morning silence shatters as Marcus, the Roman centurion, strides into the garden with his guards. Their armor gleams like fresh blood in the rising sun. "The man you killed was my brother in arms," Marcus announces, his voice carrying the weight of Rome itself. "Now your followers whisper of rebellion in the streets. They call it self-defense. They call it divine necessity." His hand rests deliberately on his sword. "Tell me, prophet of peace, how does murder taste?" Jesus rises slowly, earth clinging to his robes. Around him, the garden seems to hold its breath, the same garden where he once taught his disciples about turning the other cheek. Now those teachings feel like stones in his throat. "I see doubt in your eyes," Marcus continues, circling closer. "The same doubt I saw in my soldier's eyes before you struck him down. Perhaps you're not so different from us after all." The words pierce deeper than any blade. Throughout Jerusalem, Jesus' followers are dividing, some calling for resistance, others fleeing in disillusionment. Judas watches from the garden's edge, his expression hardening with each passing moment. Mary Magdalene steps between them, her voice steady despite her fear. "Your presence here threatens more than one man's life," she warns Marcus. "It threatens hope itself." Jesus looks at his hands, clean now, but forever changed. The choice crystallizes before him: retreat into the wilderness and preserve his spiritual purity, or stand and fight for his people in this broken world. The weight of prophecy bears down against the gravity of present danger. His decision comes, not with thunder, but with quiet certainty. "I will not run," he declares, meeting Marcus's gaze. "But neither will I let fear turn us into what we oppose. There is a path between surrender and violence, and I will walk it, even if I must walk it alone." In the shadows of the temple courtyard, Mary Magdalene tends to Jesus' wounds, bruises from a crowd that turned against him, calling him hypocrite, false prophet, killer. Her gentle hands pause over a particularly dark mark near his heart. "They say you've changed," she whispers, not meeting his eyes, "that the burden of what you did has twisted your message." The oil in her hands catches the lamplight like tears. Jesus covers her hand with his own. "Perhaps I needed to change," he answers, his voice carrying the weight of newfound understanding. "The truth I teach must survive in a world of swords and crosses, not just in parables and prayers." Throughout Jerusalem, his followers begin living this transformed message. They stand between Roman soldiers and accused criminals, offering themselves as hostages to prevent bloodshed. They share bread with their enemies, but now they also share warnings of impending arrests. Each act of mercy becomes an act of revolution, peaceful yet unflinching. Marcus watches from the shadows as Jesus' influence grows differently than before. The prophet's hands may be stained, but his power has deepened. Those who follow him now do so not because they believe him perfect, but because they've seen him wrestle with the same darkness they face. The streets buzz with tension as Passover approaches. Jesus moves through the crowds, teaching not just of love, but of love's cost. Each sermon draws more listeners and more Roman spies. Judas lingers at the edges, his expression darkening as he counts the growing number of soldiers in the crowd. Then comes the moment that changes everything. A Roman patrol drags a young girl toward the execution grounds, her only crime being the scroll of Jesus' teachings found in her home. The crowd parts in terror, all except Jesus. He steps forward, and for a heartbeat, everyone sees the memory of the soldier's blood on his hands. But Jesus doesn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he removes his cloak, revealing the scars of his own encounters with Rome. "If you seek to make an example," he calls out, his voice carrying across the sudden silence, "then take me instead. I am the author of those words, and I will pay their price." The girl runs to her mother as Jesus offers his hands to be bound. But before the soldiers can move, hundreds of others step forward, removing their cloaks to reveal similar scars. One voice becomes 100, then 1,000. "Take me instead." Marcus stands frozen, facing a power greater than any blade, the strength of chosen sacrifice over forced submission. In this moment, Jesus meets his eyes with a gaze that carries both compassion and steel. Now you see, true power lies not in dealing death, but in choosing how to live. The price of defiance comes swiftly. Marcus's replacement, a ruthless commander, orders a crackdown that turns Jerusalem's streets into a hunting ground. Jesus watches from hiding as his followers are dragged from their homes, their cries echoing through narrow alleys. Each arrest carries the weight of his original act of violence, the kill that started everything. In the gathering dark, Judas slips away from their safe house, a silver path chosen. His shadow stretches behind him like a hanging rope. Mary Magdalene finds Jesus in their last sanctuary, a forgotten tomb outside the city walls. His fingers trace the rough-hewn rock as he speaks, his voice hollow. "I see now why my Father gave me this cup, not to test my divinity, but to show me the full measure of being human." His hand clenches into a fist. One life taken, and look how many more follow into darkness. Through cracks in the stone, they hear the approaching tramp of Roman boots. Their hideout has been betrayed. Jesus closes his eyes, remembering the soldier's last breath, the weight of the blade, the moment everything changed. "Perhaps if I had died that day instead of killing." Mary grabs his shoulders, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Your death alone would have changed nothing, but your struggle, your willingness to bear both the pain of violence and the harder pain of choosing peace afterward, that has taught us more than 1,000 pristine sermons." The footsteps grow closer. In the distance, smoke rises from the temple quarter, Rome's fury made manifest. Jesus presses his forehead against the cold stone, tears cutting through the dust on his cheeks. "My Father," he whispers, "I am not the perfect vessel they needed. I am cracked and stained and human." His voice breaks. "How can I save them when I couldn't even save myself from becoming what I feared?" The tomb's darkness seems to deepen, swallowing his words. Then, through the shadows, comes a different sound, singing, faint at first, then growing stronger. The voices of his followers, not running, but gathering, standing firm despite the approaching storm. Their hymn carries, not blind worship, but something stronger, understanding. They sing not for the perfect messenger they wanted, but for the human teacher they needed. Jesus straightens, the tears on his face catching the last light like stars. Sometimes the greatest light comes only after the deepest darkness. Dawn breaks over Jerusalem like God's own promise. Jesus emerges from the tomb into the golden light, his path clear at last, not as the perfect Messiah they wanted, but as the bridge between divine grace and human struggle they needed. The singing grows louder as he walks toward the city gates, followers emerging from shadows to join him. Marcus and his legion wait in the temple courtyard, weapons ready, but Jesus approaches alone, his steps measured, deliberate. "You seek the man who killed a Roman soldier," he calls out, his voice carrying across the silent square. the proof of how violence breeds violence. He opens his arms wide. Take me, and let my people go free. Your death won't end this, Marcus warns, even as his men move to surround Jesus. No, Jesus agrees, meeting the centurion's gaze. But my choice will. He turns to his gathered followers, voice gentle, yet firm. Remember not the blood I spilled, but what rose from it. Not perfect love, but love that persists, even through our darkest choices, even through our deepest falls. Mary Magdalene steps forward, understanding dawning in her tears. You don't have to do this alone. This time, Jesus smiles, touching her cheek. I do. The Romans lead him toward Golgotha as the sun climbs higher, but something has changed in the watching crowd. Where before they saw a divine teacher brought low by human weakness, now they see strength in his vulnerability, grace in his struggles. Their whispers carry not disappointment but recognition of their own battles between spirit and flesh, between divine calling and human fear. As the cross rises against the desert sky, Jesus looks out over Jerusalem one last time. The same hands that once took a life now spread wide in a final embrace of sacrifice. His voice, though strained, carries clearly, Father, forgive them and forgive me. We are all your children, learning to carry both our divinity and our humanity. The sun sets on an empty cross, its shadow stretching toward the city like an open hand. Below, in the gathering dusk, a Roman soldier's blade lies abandoned in the dust. Beside it, an olive branch has taken root, its young leaves catching the last light like silver coins, like tears, like hope reborn through the very cracks that once threatened to destroy it.
If you enjoyed this new style, please let me know and leave a like. Have a nice day.